over this mountain, you know where I wanna go. Bob Dylan got us to Woodstock. We played with Bob for some shows through the United States and Canada. We followed Bob up to the country and started getting together in the afternoons and trying to come up with tunes.
In the early 1960s, Woodstock is a quiet country town tucked away in the rolling Catskill Mountains where musicians from Greenwich Village escape to fresh mountain air and clear spring water. You can wander into one of the small shops where locals greet you with no more than a casual nod of the head, and people answer yes sir and no ma'am. This hidden gem is a sanctuary for artists drawn to its small country charm and easygoing locals. On a given day, you can wander into Cafe Espresso and find Bob Dylan writing songs in the upstairs room. Drive down a country road and you might hear the band's flavor of Americana echoing from the basement of Big Pink. And on a random night, you could overhear Van Morrison discussing the jam session for his latest project in a thick Irish accent. But as the decade winds down, the town's growing reputation as a creative sanctuary will become its undoing. The very qualities that make Woodstock a magnet for musicians begin to attract forces that will ultimately transform it. The musicians that came fleeing madness inside Woodstock's warm small town soon find city trappings knocking on their door as betrayals are revealed, inner demons are battled, and tragedies unfold. All this while their loyalty to their newfound home is tested to the limits. What unfolded in Woodstock not only altered the course of these musicians' lives, but also transformed the small country town cherished long before any big names arrived. The question is, what really happened in Woodstock and the music community that put it on the map? The arrival of Albert Grossman, folk music's savvy manager, in 1961 plants seeds for the town's role as a music hub. Grossman buys a rambling estate and begins luring artists he manages to his home in Woodstock. In the early days of Woodstock's music scene, Greenwich Village musicians like John Sebastian and Bob Dylan began hanging out there. They would occasionally escape the pressures of the city by cutting loose in the countryside. They'd hop on motorcycles, whizzing down winding back roads, or hang out in the cafe playing chess, escaping games of city life, no doubt. Dylan spent 2 weeks in the White Room above Cafe Espresso in wintry Woodstock, finishing up iconic songs for his album Bringing It All Back Home. In 1966, the band is stuck in New York City waiting for Bob Dylan so they can get back on the road as his backing band. They get the call that Bob arranged to pay them on a retainer while he recovers. He invites them to come up to Woodstock where he is living. We stayed at Woodstock Motel for a couple weeks, and then country boy that I am, I just realized that ever since I left Ontario, I'd been living in cities, and I realized I don't have to live in cities anymore, said Rick Danko. It allowed us freedom to figure out what an artist really is. The owner of the Woodstock Motel tells them that he learned of a house for rent in nearby West Saugerties for $125 a month. Danko describes the property. It sat in the middle of 100 acres and had a pond and mountains and a lot of privacy. So Garth, Richard, and myself ended up renting the house. Robertson followed us up to Woodstock shortly afterwards, fleeing for the clean air of the Catskills. They had just come off a months-long tour with Dylan, which Levon Helms describes, "They were on us hot and heavy, boy. Them beatniks was tough."
Dylan had gone electric, and to the die-hard folk fan, he had become a traitor to the cause.
The controversy of us playing with Bob, that brought on a lot of stuff, like standing ovations of booing,
They certainly booed, I'll tell you that. You could hear it all over the place.
And it, boy, it'll make you fighting mad. I ain't joking. It'll really get under your skin, or it did me.
Yeah, I remember it well. Albert Hall, and Bob did a set at the beginning. Like, the show was in two halves, and the first half he came out and did his usual thing with the guitar and the harmonica. And then in the second half he came out with the band. Now, we knew this was going to happen anyway, but Bob just came out and he said, well, you all may know this song, remember how it goes? Well, here's how it goes now,
On a warm July day, he set off on a lonesome highway on his Triumph motorcycle, his wife following close behind in their Ford station wagon. Dylan recreates the moment to Sam Shepard. I was driving right into the sun and I looked up into it, even though I remember someone telling me a long time ago when I was a kid to never look straight into the sun because you'll be blinded. And sure enough, I went blind for a second and kind of panicked or something. I stomped down on the brake and the rear wheel locked up on me and I went flying. His wife then collects and drives Dylan an hour southeast of Woodstock and leaves him in the care of a doctor they know, not a hospital. The accident would change Bob Dylan and his music from that point on. He told Newsweek that he'd stared at the ceiling for a few months. Then he described himself for the first time as a country boy myself, and you have to be let alone to really accomplish anything. After a few get-togethers at Dylan's house, he took to driving a baby blue Mustang over to Big Pink. Robertson would make his way over from a small cottage Grossman provided, and they would jam together in what Dylan remembered as a typical basement with pipes, a concrete floor, and a washer-dryer. Bob started coming by nearly every day during his recovery. Danko recalled Dylan showing up at noon most days and then heading home before 6 o'clock to make it in time for dinner with his family. If we were sleeping, he'd get us up, Danko said. He would make some big noise or bang the typewriter on the coffee table to wake them up.
Like those friends of yours that keep... Bob and Richard used to have a typewriter that sat on the coffee table there in the living room, and the two of them would go by and type little notes to each other, and one would read what the other one wrote, put a couple of lines in under that. A lot of times by the end of the day, we'd have a couple of 3 pages out of there.
Soon it was time to make music. Many were cover versions of folk staples Bob knew since his early days in the Village. The songs were taped in the basement of Big Pink between June and October on a reel-to-reel recorder that Richard Manuel had bought for $140. We'd just go downstairs and play some chords, figure out some phrasing, then Bob would come down and we'd take it from there, Danko described. They drank and smoked and howled with laughter.
To go against the grain as far as the flavor of music at that time. We turned it back and went more blues, more roots music oriented.
It was the kind of music that made you feel like you were part of something very, very special and nobody else had a part of it, Dylan said of the songs. And back then, it was hard to get to. Serves you well. The basement tapes were more an homage to Harry Smith's influential anthology of American folk music, released in 1952, than the psychedelic music of the moment. Regardless of whatever's been written about Bob and his creative genius, he's basically a lover of American music, says musician Larry Campbell.
Wheels on the fire. Your memory serves you well. There was no con, there was no bullshit, it was absolutely legitimate songwriting without any kind of frills.
It seemed to vault over the zeitgeist back to pure roots, kind of counterculture. The psychedelic bands were playing bits of blues and country, but the band seemed to have real authority, describes another musician. Dylan said in 2014, "We weren't really participating in any of that stuff where it was the summer of love. We weren't there, so we did our own thing. We wrote $1 Million Bash to go along with the summer of love."
Watching Bob, helping Bob construct some songs, everybody got a better idea of how to put a song together.
They wrote songs plucked from newspaper or television stories. You kind of look for ideas and the TV would be on, As the World Turns, Dark Shadows or something. Just any old thing would create a beginning to a song, names out of phone books and things, Bob said.
And from doing that, a lot of good arrangements came from that, a lot of musical ideas and just us living our lives, you know, just establishing some little life rules. It was an incredible time period.
We wanted to go against what was going down at the time. We weren't too psychedelic in our style, our dress, or our attitude. Yeah, that was when you didn't trust anybody over 30, or maybe it was 40. We were already that old, whatever the age was.
It was clear just how counter-revolutionary Dylan and the band had been. The man who inspired the hippie generation had become the ultimate anti-hippie. I remember hearing Jefferson Airplane and Grateful Dead on recordings, but we were over in the hills, said Rick Danko. He goes on, while people were stacking up Marshall amps and blowing out their eardrums, we were in the basement trying to get a balance. It wasn't about one person trying to blow the other away. It was about trying to play together and find an economical common ground.
I listened to this album and I thought, this is it. This is where music is supposed to have gone for a long time, and it hasn't really got there. And now it's finally, someone's finally gone and done it.
He said, that's okay, boy, won't you be gentle whenever you can. I want you to take a load off.
And I was staying at the Plaza Hotel, and just by chance, George Harrison was staying at the hotel, and just by chance, Jimi Hendrix was staying at the hotel, the good old 60s. And Eric Clapton came up saying, you've got to hear this tape. You've got to play this band too.
Levon was just salt of the earth, right from the soil of Arkansas. At Big Pink, there were lots of late-night parties, records Aronowitz. They'd pass the guitar around, and Levon was always the star of the evening. He'd play the mandolin and sing great old songs like Caledonia. But with success comes turbulence. There were concerns over Richard Manuel's habit of liking the bottle. He was deeply sensitive, as many witnessed Manuel's consumption almost nightly at the Sled Hill Cafe. Then, as it turned out, the band was unable to enjoy the rave reviews for music from the Big Pink. Just as the band was rising to fame, Danko was driving his beloved Lincoln Continental on an icy road in Woodstock. He lost control of the vehicle, which skidded off the road. The accident left Danko with a broken neck, a severe injury that required him to wear a medical halo brace screwed into his skull for months. Danko's rehabilitation was slow and painful, but he remained resilient, often seen around town with his brace. The incident delayed the band's touring plans as Danko needed time to recover before resuming performances.
It had all kinds of effects. It stimulated me, it moved me, and it upset me and made me very discontent all at the same time. And I think it had a similar effect on a lot of people.
Inspired, Dylan began to write new songs of his own. Garth Hudson says, Bob would sit at the window and it was the perfect writing situation. A couch, coffee table, a typewriter, 2 yellow legal pads with pencils, and he'd look out the window, and way off in the distance there were mountains, and he'd write. As the Big Pink sessions wound down, there's music from Bob's house and there's music from our house, Robbie Robertson says. The two houses sure are different. John Wesley Harding bridged Dylan's folk and rock eras with a timeless sound that anticipated the Americana movement. He spun parables filled with mysterious outlaws, drifters, and spiritual musings. All Along the Watchtower channeled existential tension and foreboding, eventually immortalized in Jimi Hendrix's electrified cover. Dylan has claimed that he thought of the song during a thunderstorm.
There must be some kind of way out of here.
He employs a nonlinear narrative structure that adds to the song's enigmatic and timeless quality. The lyrics are sparse and open-ended, beginning with what feels like the middle of a conversation.
There must be some way out of here. Said the joker to the thief.
As the song unfolds, Dylan introduces vivid yet fragmented imagery of a bleak, surreal landscape. The dialogue between the Joker and the thief hints at despair and societal corruption. By the time the song concludes, the perspective shifts dramatically, suggesting an ominous culmination of unseen events. The ending feels like a return to the beginning, creating a sense of circularity.
shadows were approaching. The wind began to howl.
Al Aronowitz described Dylan and his wife during this time as the ideal loving couple who flirted with each other constantly, a drama full of romance, wisecracks, and everyday common sense.
Close your eyes, close the door.
When Macmillan's Bob Markle visited in February 1968 to discuss Tarantula, he found Dylan far more friendly, far less distracted, more grown up and professional, easy to be with.
Some petty jealousies live by no man's code.
Someone tipped Dylan off to the fact that Albert Grossman was making a lot more money than anyone, including Dylan, on his music. Bob did not know that he was giving away the rights to his songs when he handed them over to Albert to publish. Once this truth was revealed, Bob set out to undo his contract, which he then discovered was for 10 years, signed when he was just a mere 20 years old. He then begins a quest to correct this wrong. Bob secretly set up his own publishing company behind the scenes to take over publishing his songs. I finally had to sue him, Dylan later said. Because Albert wanted it quiet, he settled out of court. He had me signed up for 10 years, for part of my records, for part of my everything. Robbie Robertson had arranged for George Harrison and wife Patty Boyd to stay with the Grossmans for a visit. George Harrison explains, "It was strange because at the time Bob and Grossman were going through this fight, the crisis about managing him. I would spend the day with Bob and the night with Grossman and hear both sides of the battle." George came to visit at a time when there were also tensions with the Beatles. Harrison heard in the band's album a warmth, a spirit of brotherhood far removed from the pitfalls of stardom.
Sex, drugs, rock and roll, those are the things that they're using to sell rock and roll, which seems a damn shame when you get down to it. The music is certainly capable of doing that on its own.
The band's self-titled second album, often referred to as the Brown Album, is a masterclass in storytelling and musical craftsmanship, blending Americana rock and folk traditions into a deeply evocative soundscape.
One of the things we started doing was instead of a song going like, "Up on Cripple Creek, she sends me if I sprang a leak," or if the weight went, "I pulled in and that's a rough feeling about half past dead." Not very much fun. So we halved it. "Up on Cripple Creek, she sends me." And it'll jerk more and punch more. Get over this mountain. And there's a break in the music, and Garth did that jaw harp thing. And that was the hook that just pulled your ear right in, and by the time you listened to it, the drums would do the kickoff again, and it would roll back in and go through again.
The album paints vivid pictures of American life, history, and heartache. Its raw, earthy production and communal spirit have made it an enduring cornerstone of rock history.
Up on Cripple Creek, and she sends me if I sprang a leak, that she mends me. I don't have so my troubles out the door. I don't need them anymore.
Nashville's skyline marked a dramatic shift in Bob's sound, embracing country music with warmth and simplicity. The album features Dylan's newly softened and crooning vocal style, reflecting a contented phase of his life. The album was so completely at odds with the counterculture, it was perceived as a rejection of it.
Lay, lady, lay, lay across my big breast bed.
Songs like Lay Lady Lay go on to be one of his enduring songs, as well as a duet with Johnny Cash on Girl from the North Country.
See for me that her hair's hanging.
Dylan's lyrics took on a gentler, more romantic turn, steering away from the dense poetic complexity of his earlier work. Nashville Skyline showcases his versatility while puzzling some fans accustomed to his folk and rock songs. It remains a celebrated exploration of Americana and country traditions.
Peggy Day stole my poor heart away.
Woodstock's music scene flourished, not only in its clubs and bars, but in the homes where musicians jammed and collaborated. The whole thing was growing, says Happy Traum. People would suddenly turn up in town. You could see anybody on the streets of Woodstock.
And the caravan is on its way.
Before coming to Woodstock, Van Morrison had been traumatized by the dealings surrounding his contract with Bang Records. Much like Dylan, he was locked into an unfair deal he wanted out of. When producer Burt Burns died in the middle of negotiations, his widow inherited Morrison's contract and blocked the royalties to his songs, including Brown Eyed Girl. At the time Van Morrison had just got a top 10 hit, he was sleeping on someone's couch and left penniless until he was eventually able to get Warner Brothers to buy out his contract and free him up. He left Boston for New York, where he played a gig in Woodstock. Van Morrison explains, "It was basic survival because I hadn't gotten any money from Brown Eyed Girl." Disenchanted with the commercial mainstream after his experience with Burns, he began developing his own style of music. Woodstock serves as the perfect backdrop for this experimentation. By the time Morrison arrived in Woodstock, he had finished up recording Astral Weeks and was transitioning towards a new phase in his career. The peaceful, artist-friendly environment of Woodstock provided him with the space and inspiration to develop the music that would define his next albums, including Moondance and his band and the Street Choir. Woodstock's creative community and natural beauty are a welcome refuge for Morrison and his family during this time of reinvention. Moondance embraced the idea of grounding oneself in simpler pleasures and human connections.
Half a mile from the county fair, and the rain came pouring down.
The album opens with And It Stoned Me, a nostalgic, vivid recollection of youthful wonder, setting the tone for the record's blend of personal storytelling and universal themes. The title track Moondance became an enduring classic, a jazzy, swing-infused piece that feels both timeless and intimate. Songs like Caravan and Into the Mystic capture a mystical and spiritual longing. Almost any night at Sled Hill, you could see Van dropping in, said Artie Traum. Van was one of the funniest people that have ever lived, just totally strange. He would call us up to come to the house for a jam session, but by the time you got there, he had forgotten that he'd called and would send you home. John Platania says, "If you get Van at the right moment, he's gregarious and great fun."
Well, it's a marvelous night for a moon dance with the stars up above.
He's not some sort of misanthrope, Gershon said. He's just incredibly shy and ill-prepared for societal interaction of any kind. He just didn't know how to fit in. Next up is his band and the Street Choir, an exuberant and eclectic album that radiates a raw, joyous energy. Recordings began with a demo session at a small church in Woodstock, which was not intended to produce any official releases. During its course, Morrison worked on a leftover material from his previous two albums, Astral Weeks and Moondance. Domino, the album's opening track and biggest hit. Domino is a lively ode to rhythm and blues that became one of Morrison's highest charting singles in the US. Its infectious energy and catchy groove set the tone for the album. He would just call us up and say, "What are you doing?" John Gershon remembers. We'd get together and play Hank Williams records. We weren't looking for anything from him. There became a growing friendship between Van Morrison and Richard Manuel. For Van, Richard was the real soul of the band. Manuel also made Morrison howl with laughter. Canadians had a different sense of humor than Americans, and I understood that more, Morrison says. Richard was a very funny guy. His one-liners were killers. To Morrison's old sax player Graham Blackburn, the two musicians were born soulmates, both extraordinary singers, both painfully introverted.
Yet I swear I see my reflection.
Part of my desire to be a great musician was just to cover a lot of insecurity and feelings of, lack of self-esteem. And I recognized that in Richard immediately, and he was so shy and so insecure and so fragile. And yet coupled with that, he had this amazing power to move you with his music and with his voice.
The rumble in the alley. Oh, you don't know the shape I'm in.
The band had good reason to call their third album Stage Fright. On the eve of their live debut in San Francisco, Robbie Robertson fell ill, almost canceling the show, and even he suspected fear played a role. Performing their music in front of a crowd of hippies in the heart of acid rock territory was daunting. The title track reflected 5 men who had been living in the country, avoiding the spotlight. The unexpected success of the band thrust them into stardom they hadn't anticipated. When word spread about Dylan, the band, and other artists residing in Woodstock, fans and tourists began to flock to the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of their idols or absorb the town's creative energy. By the early summer of 1969, the Elephant and the Espresso were packed almost every weekend. One of those hoping to absorb Woodstock's creative energy, inspired by his idol, is Jimi Hendrix. Dylan really turned me on, he says in March 1968. Not the words or his guitar, but as a way to get myself together. Hendrix accepted an offer to play at the upcoming Woodstock Music Festival and began rehearsing. Shortly after returning from holiday in Morocco, he headed to Woodstock for a jam at the Tinker Street Cinema, a former Methodist church turned into a movie house. I remember the music coming out of there, recalls Richard Hepner, then a boy. My dad was so pissed about the noise. Only later did I realize it was Hendrix. Al Gordon notes that the jam happened the same night Johnny Winter played at the Cafe Espresso and Van Morrison hung out at Sled Hill Cafe. It was less than a week before the festival, and Jimmy was practicing the Star-Spangled Banner at the Tinker Street Cinema. The Woodstock Music Festival of 1969, held on a dairy farm in Bethel, New York, attracted over 400,000 attendees, far exceeding the anticipated 50,000. Despite its location being 60 miles from the town of Woodstock, the festival's association with the town's name cemented its place in history as the epitome of the 1960s counterculture. For the small artistic community of Woodstock, the event's massive popularity brought an influx of tourists and fame, forever changing the quiet town's identity from a creative haven to a destination synonymous with the counterculture. For many, Woodstock ruined Woodstock. Some believe Woodstock's golden age was already over. The days when Dylan could sit undisturbed at the Espresso were gone. It seems to me it went fairly quickly from being the hippest place you could go to almost Touristville, says John Niven. It was already becoming a caricature of what it had been. A lot of people were quite troubled, so there was this notion that if I put myself in some kind of new surroundings, things will get better. But changing your locale doesn't change what's going on inside of you. Dylan was slowly falling out of love with the Woodstock scene. Hippies were finding their way up to his home, searching for the folk messiah. The Dylans came home to find people in their swimming pool, some harmless, some scary. Fearing for the safety of his family, Dylan requested a personal hotline to the Woodstock police chief and even bought a Winchester that he referred to as the Great Equalizer. He had a very gutsy, confrontational side, said Bruce Dorfman. One time he asked me to come up to his house because he'd heard some noises in there. So we went in and roused a couple out of his and his wife's bed. He went to get his Winchester, and it wasn't a conversation. Back in Manhattan in the summer of 1970, Hendrix had a brief encounter with Bob Dylan, who happened to be cycling past the guitarist's limousine. It was an eerie scene, Dylan remembered. He was slouched down in the back. It was strange. Both of us were a little lost for words. He'd gone through like a fireball without knowing it. I'd done the same thing, like being shot out of a cannon. That summer, Hendrix told Richie Havens at the Isle of Wight festival that his managers were killing him and he couldn't eat or sleep. Havens suggested that he contact his attorney, who had a private property in Woodstock, and offered to introduce them in London after the festival. Hendrix never showed up, and 3 weeks later, Havens learned of his death. For Dylan himself, it had all finally become too much. Even behind the gates of his mountain estate, he felt vulnerable. In 1985, he spoke of people living in trees outside of my house, trying to batter down my car door, cars following me up dark mountain roads. I wanted to set fire to these people, he wrote in Chronicles. Most musicians around this time were freaked out about the Manson murders in Los Angeles. In chronicles, he is unequivocal. Woodstock had turned into a nightmare, a place of chaos. Now it was time to scramble out of there in search of some new silver lining. For Dylan, Woodstock had transformed from a sanctuary into a kind of prison. The festival was the sum total of all the bullshit, he wrote later, and I got very resentful about the whole thing. Van Morrison was trying to contain his own restlessness. After the festival was over, Morrison claimed he'd moved to Woodstock to escape the scene, and then Woodstock started being the scene. Everybody and his uncle started showing up at the bus station, and that was the complete opposite of what it was supposed to be. Morrison soon left for California and claims he was welcomed in Marin County with a friendliness he'd never experienced in Woodstock. California was very different, he says. Everybody was very open, whereas Woodstock was very closed. If you didn't buy into the hippie vibe, then you were out. Significantly, Morrison included his tribute to Old Woodstock on 1971's Tupelo Honey and sang about the town's cool night breezes and shady trees. By January 1970, they graced the cover of Time magazine. William Bender wrote that the band appealed to a generation looking for something gentler and more profound, after rejecting the chaos of the counterculture. But their fraternal bond was strained. Fame, money, and substance began to erode the group's chemistry. Richard Manuel battled his demons, reportedly consuming quarts of Grand Marnier daily. Levon Helm and Rick Danko had their own struggles. After the Time cover, things got a little crazy, Danko admitted, though Woodstock locals looked after them. While the police chief dismissed the hippies as bums and freeloaders, he gave the band leniency, with locals affectionately referring to them as the boys. Eventually, the members of the band experienced a gradual shift away from their communal life in Woodstock. The town had been pivotal to their creative and personal growth. Their shared time at Big Pink and the surrounding Catskills had fostered a unique musical chemistry. But as fame and personal circumstances evolved, their ties to the band began to loosen.
It just didn't work anymore, and there didn't seem to be a whole lot that anybody could do about it. I think the Suits pretty much had control of it by then, and were running with the ball.
The band has been together 16 years, together on the road. We did 8 years in bars, dives, dance halls.
Collaboration suffered a whole lot. The real deal, as far as business deals go, started to reveal itself, and a lot of the heart went out of it at that point.
The success can rear its head like a big ugly beast, or it can also be like an angel with thick wings, you know, and I'm sure we got to experience all those emotions, you know.
The Woodstock they had once known was not the same. The town, once a secluded artist haven, was becoming a tourist destination after the 1969 festival. The increasing visibility and influx of visitors disrupted the peace that had initially drawn the musicians there. By the 1970s, the band's members were no longer living as a tight-knit group in Woodstock, reflecting both the transformation of the town and their own diverging paths. Richard Manuel's death in 1986 marked a heartbreaking chapter for the band and underscored the challenges that had plagued them in the years following their initial success. Manuel, whose soulful voice and emotive piano playing were integral to the group's sound, had struggled with a substance habit and a sense of being overshadowed creatively. On March 4, 1986, after a performance in Florida, during a reunion tour without Robbie Robertson, Manuel tragically could no longer carry on and was found in his hotel room. His death sent shockwaves through the music community and deeply affected the surviving members of the band, who mourned both the loss of their friend and the enduring scars of their turbulent journey.
I shall be relieved. Oh, you don't know the shape I'm in.
It's interesting how fate stepped in and changed the path that these musicians were on with Bob's accident. Who knows how things could have turned out differently if they would have continued touring to audiences booing them every night. Their work developed in the warmth and nurturing space of Woodstock as they gave life to music that is still considered some of the best ever recorded. Day-to-day life and struggles unfolding in the backdrop, as they left behind this incredible music. They embraced authenticity, following their own ideas and instincts rather than trying to fit into the changing scene. And it's no accident that both Bob Dylan and Van Morrison are still on tour all these years later, while many of their counterparts who followed the scene fell off the radar along with the psychedelic era. In the 1970s, Woodstock is no longer a quiet country town. Some musicians stuck around, and others who had given it life moved on, leaving behind a town forever changed.
Riders were approaching.